thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, published in 1962, and the movie adaptation, also titled One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, came out in 1975 and is directed by Milos Forman. So last summer, I covered Sometimes a Great Notion, which is also by Ken Kesey. I have my first edition copy right here. There's a terrible glare on it though. Anyway, that was adapted into a movie starring Paul Newman, Henry Fonda, and Lee Remick. And if you saw that video or heard me talk about it in reading wrap-ups, you will know that I love Sometimes a Great Notion. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed the movie too, but the book especially, I absolutely loved it. So you would think, considering I read one of Kesey's novels and absolutely was obsessed with it, you would think I would have rushed to read more of his work. And obviously I knew of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest because that is his most famous book, far more famous than Sometimes a Great Notion. And as far as the movies are concerned, you know, the movie Cuckoo's Nest is so much more well known than Great Notion. However, I did not rush to read it because I had heard from multiple sources that Cuckoo's Nest was very sexist. I was worried that if I read a sexist book by Kesey that I potentially might not like, that it would taint my love for Sometimes a Great Notion, right? And so I held off on reading it. However, it was of course on my radar, and I had seen the movie, but it was in like 2010, and honestly I remembered very little from it. So I was wanting to cover it at some point. But Shelby requested this, so thank you Shelby for requesting this book and movie, and I decided to cover it sooner rather than later thanks to her request. And I do love getting book first movie requests from my listeners and my viewers. You can email me, you can comment, you can message me on Instagram. I will be totally honest, I am not the best at doing them quickly. It usually takes me a few months. There was someone who requested My Abandon and the movie adaptation. I forget what the movie adaptation is called. But anyway, that one has been on my list forever, and I even got the book from Libby, but I just keep putting it off. So I apologize for people who have made requests and I just haven't done it. But there have been a number of ones that I do get to, you know, Room, The Power of the Dog, Sometimes a Great Notion was a request. So anyway, I love getting requests, and I apologize if it takes me a while to get to them, but I do appreciate people submitting requests. So anyway, onto the book review. So I will say this book is incredibly sexist. So what I read from those other people was right. And it isn't sexist simply because the villain is a woman. Like, I love books and movies with female villains. You know, Misery right here, my Suntup Press edition, which I'm so proud of. Misery is one of my very favorite books, and we have a great female villain. Granted, in Misery, she represents something more. Check out my book first movie if you want to hear me talk about Misery and why I love it so much. But yeah, I love a great female antagonist, so it's not that. What makes it sexist is that there's just so much in the book that is said negatively about women and the way women are represented. Every single female character in this book is just represented in a poor way, and none of them are shown positively. And it seems like Kesey used this novel to like push his agenda against the feminist movement, and it was his way of showing why women should not be in charge, they should not be in the workforce, they should be at home, and they should be submissive to men. Is basically like the message of this book, honestly, and it's very masculinity versus femininity, and it was just not a theme I enjoyed. It also is kind of racist as well, even though it's written from the perspective of a Native American, and his character Bromden is very fleshed out. And we see how people are racist towards him, but then even though it does a great job showing this Native American, it then is racist towards African Americans. And so that also just rubbed me the wrong way. However, like, Kesey is a fantastic writer. So I knew that based on Sometimes a Great Notion, because that book is so amazingly written and so technical, and clearly Kesey is talented. And so I went into this one expecting some good writing. And I got that too, because it could have been such a great book, because the male characters at least have like depth and they're interesting characters, and it's well written and it's a good story. But if Kesey just had, you know, made a few changes to the story, like, it could have been a great book, but it was just so sexist and offensive at times. It wasn't so bad that I stopped, you know, like with The Godfather, I just could not read any further and I DNF'd like 75% of the way through. So this one I did finish. So maybe that's a testament to Kesey's writing, I guess. But I would recommend it, but I would, you know, just be aware. I went into this very aware of the offensive content in here. It was still offensive. It's not like it didn't bother me because I knew, but I would recommend it, but just be aware of what you are getting yourself into. And then there is a lot of symbolism in this book between the Bible. So like McMurphy, the main character, a lot of the events parallel what happened with Christ in the New Testament. And when I realized, there was a moment where it clicked for me and I was like, wow, this is like almost like a retelling of the Christ story in a way. And so when I realized that, it made me appreciate the writing even more, and I could see what Kesey was going for with certain scenes. It still doesn't excuse the overall sexist theme, but it made me appreciate the book more. And I thought these religious parallels were fascinating. So I will be getting to that like at the end after I've gone over the plot. I will then share the moments that were like specifically parallel to something that happened in the story of Christ. And by the way, that reminded me of Cool Hand Luke, which I also have a book verse movie for. Huge Paul Newman fan. He's in the Sometimes a Great Notion adaptation. But anyway, Cool Hand Luke is also, the character of Luke is also a symbol of Christ, because McMurphy and Luke both show up in, the situation where there's all these men who are beaten down and downtrodden and hopeless and helpless. And then this guy shows up and he becomes a symbol of hope and freedom and inspiration. And he inspires these men and makes them gain their confidence back to some level. And so Cuckoo's Nest and Cool Hand Luke are very similar in that regard. And as far as books go, despite the content of Cuckoo's Nest, I would say I like Cuckoo's Nest better than Cool Hand Luke, because the book Cool Hand Luke I found a little boring at times and it was just hard to get through. Whereas movies, I just love Paul Newman so much, so I would almost say I like the movie Cool Hand Luke better than Cuckoo's Nest. But Cuckoo's Nest is obviously just so incredibly iconic, and it's in everywhere in pop culture. It's referenced constantly in other movies and TV shows. And then Nurse Ratched, which I had heard of Nurse Ratched before I had heard of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So just that character of Nurse Ratched has also just become such an iconic figure. And there's that TV show called Ratched with Sarah Paulson, which shows what her life was like before working at this mental institution, I guess. So I'm a little curious to watch that show now that I've read the book. So if I do, I'll do a follow-up video talking about that TV show. I'm kind of hesitant. I believe it's Ryan Murphy, and I'm not a huge Ryan Murphy fan, so I don't know if I'll get into that TV show. But anyway, on to the movie. The movie is an improvement on the book in some ways because it doesn't feel sexist or racist. So that right there is awesome. And yet there were scenes from the book that I missed not having in the movie. However, this movie swept the Oscars. It did incredible. And like I said, it's just still so iconic. So it is one I would definitely recommend. And even though I didn't love the movie, some people go crazy for it, but I would still recommend it just because of the impact it has had on our culture. It's worth watching for that. And the performances are fantastic. Louise Fletcher, who rest in peace, she died a couple months ago. She won an Oscar for her role as Nurse Ratched, and Jack Nicholson won for his role as McMurphy. This movie also won Best Picture. It might have won Best Director, I think, which that's when I watched this in 2010. I was going through movies that had won Best Picture and I was trying to watch all of them. I never did get around to watching all of them yet, but anyway. And the side characters, or the supporting actors as well, I was very impressed with. They filmed this at an actual mental institute in Oregon, and so a lot of the background actors were real patients at the institute. And so a lot of the actors also, they were constantly around these real life patients. And I read that the actors never broke character, and they always kind of stayed in that mindset. And a couple of them, it almost seems like it really did get to them. The actor, I forget which character he plays now. I will put his picture up here if you're watching this on YouTube, because now I can't remember which character he is. There were times where he was a bit unhinged, in the final scene. He was doing a bit too much, and they were like, whoa, calm down, buddy. And then also Danny DeVito kind of created this imaginary friend that he would talk to, and it started to worry him. And so he talked to a psychiatrist while he was on the set, being like, hey, I talk to this imaginary friend every night as if they're real. But the doctor was like, oh, I wouldn't worry about it. Anyway, so they were very in character. And speaking of Danny DeVito, he and Christopher Lloyd are two standouts because obviously they went on to become very famous. And this was the first movie Christopher Lloyd was in. I don't think it was the first movie for Danny DeVito, but it was their first significant roles, and both of them are fantastic. And then I also have to mention Scatman Carruthers, who has a small role. He's probably in 5 minutes of the movie, but he was also in The Shining, which of course also starred Jack Nicholson. And yes, I have a book versus movie for The Shining. You should definitely check that one out. Absolutely loved it. But anyway, so it was cool seeing him in this. And so he and Jack Nicholson have worked together twice. And another Shining connection, Shelley Duvall auditioned, or she wanted the role of Candy. However, she didn't get the part. So that's funny because Shelley Duvall, of course, is the wife, Wendy, in The Shining. So that's my book and movie spoiler-free reviews. I would recommend both of them. And now as I get into the differences between book and movie, I want to warn you there will be spoilers from here on out for both book and movie. Also, I feel like I'm kind of scattered today. Maybe I've just had more caffeine, and so I feel like I'm just high energy, but also kind of scattered. so I apologize. But anyway, I'm going to start with Chief Bromden, because Chief Bromden is a huge character in the book because he is the narrator, whereas in the book there is no narrator, and Bromden, he's an important character for sure, but he's more of a side character, whereas in the book, he is, the focus is McMurphy, but it's told through Bromden's eyes and his perspective. And in the book, like right away, we learn that Bromden can speak and hear, but he pretends that he can't. And so because of that, he's able to overhear a lot of private conversations because people and staff will say whatever they want around him because they assume he can't hear them. And when McMurphy first shows up, he goes around introducing himself to all of the patients and shaking their hands and being very lively and very friendly. And he goes up to Bromden, introduces himself, and he puts his hand out for a handshake, and people tell him don't bother with him, he can't hear you. But Bromden can see that McMurphy doesn't buy it. And so McMurphy right away is like, I know you can hear, and I know you can speak. And Bromden does eventually shake his hand. And in both book and movie, at some point, Bromden does speak to McMurphy, revealing the truth. And like I said, in the book, McMurphy wasn't surprised because he knew he could speak. He wasn't buying the act. And so it shows how McMurphy could see deeper into people, and he was more intuitive, right? Whereas so many other people just blindly believed, oh yeah, he's deaf and dumb, whatever, and they never paid him any attention. But in the movie, he is surprised because in the movie, he did think Bromden was deaf and dumb. And so when Bromden speaks to him, McMurphy is impressed and wow, you really got one over on them. I even believed you. And so that was a big difference right there. Also in the book, eventually Bromden starts speaking to everybody, but in the movie, he never does. He only speaks to McMurphy. And in the book, we get a lot of flashbacks to Bromden's life before he was in the mental institution. And I loved these segments of the book. They were some of my favorite. And we get a section where he reflects how before he started pretending to be deaf and dumb, people treated him like he was deaf and dumb. And because he was treated that way is the reason why he eventually started to pretend. And the specific stories when he's a boy, a young man, young teenager or something, he's outside and these three white people come up because they want to talk to his dad, who is the chief, because it's something about taking over the land. And so they want to talk to the chief, and they're just talking as if Bromden isn't even there, as if he can't hear them, and they're just talking openly and saying offensive things. And so Bromden steps up and he speaks very eloquently and articulately to them, hoping to catch them off guard. But they totally ignore him as if he didn't say anything at all, and they just dismiss him and they just go about on their way. And so that was the first time where people treated him as if he wasn't even there and as if he didn't matter and as if he couldn't even speak and hear what they were saying. And then Bromden, he is huge. He's a tall, massive guy. And yet when McMurphy meets him, McMurphy says something about Bromden's size. And Bromden is what do you mean? You're bigger than I am. And it's because Bromden, figuratively speaking, he feels small because before the mental institution, before Nurse Ratched, the world, which he calls the Combine, made him and his dad just get smaller and smaller and feel so insignificant. And in the book, he talks about his mom got bigger and his dad got smaller and his mom was white. Anyway, and so he says that to McMurphy, and McMurphy is like, what, are you kidding me? You're huge. And then McMurphy tells him you know what, I'm going to get you on my training program, and before our time is done, you're going to be back to your football size and you're going to be huge. And McMurphy's training program, isn't anything physical. It's more emotional and mental, and the way he raises these men up and builds their confidence. He builds Bromden's confidence back up that he does to feel huge again, and he realizes that he isn't small and insignificant. And that whole thing is in the book, is in the movie as well, where Bromden says that he's small. But it felt more substantial and more of a thing in the book, but it is mentioned in the movie. And then in the movie, we do get scenes where it's just the doctors or just McMurphy and a doctor. But like I said, the book is told from Bromden's perspective, so we don't see anything that he doesn't see. However, there are times where he can overhear what the doctors or orderlies are saying, again, because they assume he can't hear them. So we do get that look into what the doctors think. But yeah, we don't get any behind closed doors kind of scenes because Bromden, if he wasn't there, then we don't find out about it. And on to Nurse Ratched. So when McMurphy first shows up in the book and movie, like I said, he's very lively and he's laughing and he's just such a presence as he comes in, and he gets card games going and basketball games going, and he stands up to Nurse Ratched multiple times. And also real quick with McMurphy, he's the hero of this book, right? But he's more of an anti-hero, I would say. And the reason, so he was at a work farm, which is basically prison. And then from the work farm, they were he's a psychopath. He needs to go to a mental institution. But the reason he was in the work farm to begin with was for statutory rape of a 15-year-old. And when it's discussed in book and movie, he's like, hey, like she was more than willing, if you know what I mean. And she claimed she was 18, like she basically forced me and I had no idea she was underage. And then on top of that, he uses racial slurs against the black orderlies a lot. And so he's definitely like not the most likable person, and yet he is the hero of the story. And on one hand, I can appreciate that Kesey did the anti-hero style and made him, you know, because no one in life is totally good or totally bad, right? All of us are morally gray to some extent. And so I appreciate that he didn't try to make this perfect example of a man, but at the same time, it's also kind of like, did he have to have him be in for that reason though? Because that's just gross. And so I don't know, I have mixed feelings about that as well. But anyway, the first group meeting they are in, the group therapy meeting, they're talking about Harding, and Ratched brings up some of topics from Harding's life that they had discussed previously. And eventually all the men start chiming in, like giving their opinion on Harding and picking on him, and it just does not go well. I mean, in Nurse Ratched eyes, maybe it does, but after it's over, McMurphy goes over to Harding and he tells him how like that was a pecking party, meaning with chickens, how they like pick one chicken to peck at and they like peck at it till it dies. And he's like, but then after that one dies, they just move on to a new chicken. And Harding is being like, what do you mean? Nurse Ratched wants the best for us, blah, blah, blah. But then eventually Harding talks about how the men, including the doctor, are all rabbits and the nurse is the wolf. And he's like, we're just rabbits. We know our place. We know we're below the wolf who is the nurse, and we just accept that. And we're just like skittish and scared because that's just what rabbits do. And we let ourselves be manipulated by her because what else are we going to do? A rabbit isn't going to stand up to a wolf. That would just be dumb. And then McMurphy replies calling her a ball cutter. The quote from the book says, no, that nurse ain't some kind of monster chicken, buddy. What she is a ball cutter. I've seen thousands of them, old and young, men and women. Seen them all over the country and in the homes. People who try to make you weak so that they can get you to toe the line and follow their rules, to live like they want you to. Side note, like, he's upset that Nurse Ratched tries to get the men to toe the line and follow the rules. It's like, what do you expect? She's in charge of a mental ward? Like, she has to be strict and she has to get these men to follow the rules. Otherwise, it could be potential chaos, right? Like, literally, like, what else would you expect? Do you expect her to allow herself to be walked over by these mental patients? So, yeah, anyway. But after that, Harding talks about, you know, how they could put Nurse Ratched in her place and how to put women in general. Like, how do men put women in their place? And he says, so you see, my friend, it is somewhat as you stated. Man has but one truly effective weapon against the juggernaut of modern matriarchy, but it certainly is not laughter. One weapon, and with every passing year in this hip, motivationally researched society, more and more people are discovering how to render that weapon useless and conquer those who have hitherto been the conquerors. And basically what he's insinuating is that the way you get a woman to know her place and to get her in line and to show them who's boss is to have sex with them. And it's kind of implied that it would be forceful. But McMurphy admits that despite Nurse Ratched, like, she's not bad looking. And so often in this book, they have to talk about her breasts and how large they are. And so despite her breasts and her good looks, he admits that he still wouldn't be able to perform with her. And he says, I see what you're driving at, and by God, you're right. I couldn't get it up over old frozen face in there, even if she had the beauty of Marilyn Monroe. And so it is decided between Harding and McMurphy that because Nurse Ratched had made herself so unappealing to the men sexually that they wouldn't even be able to perform with her, that she therefore has won over them. Because if that's the only way a man can put a woman in her place, and if a man can't quote unquote get it up with her, then there's no way for him to put her in her place, right? And so she therefore has won over them. And the reason they find her sexually unappealing is because she is stern and because she's in charge and because she is superior over them and she's telling them what to do, and because they feel so inferior, they therefore just like have lost their confidence and they wouldn't be able to perform, according to Kesey. So according to Kesey, if a woman is in charge, that is a huge turnoff. And of course, Nurse Ratched was manipulative as well. I don't want to make it seem like she truly had the best intentions for the patients at all times and that they just did not like her because she was a woman. She does abuse her power, and we see especially in the end with Billy Bibbits, and she used the opportunity to get him where she knew it would hurt in order to weaken him and get her control back over him. But yeah. But women being seen as sex objects and seeing womanhood as a weakness is like why this book is so offensively sexist, right? Because again, her breasts are talked about so much, and it's talked about how she tries to hide them and like hide her femininity. And if we had like some nuance here where maybe if we got a look into Nurse Ratched's life, and maybe if we saw, this is 1962, so maybe if we saw how out in the world, how men treated her and how they doubted her because she's a woman, and just the sexism of the world, if we could see how that caused her to maybe be unusually cruel to these men who are patients, that would have provided like some more depth to her character, right? But there is no depth to her. She's just this mean, stern nurse who's in charge. And all the female characters in this book are portrayed negatively. Like the woman in charge of the whole hospital is also a woman, which is why they say they're under control of a matriarchy. But also Billy Bibbit's mom is very manipulative and messed up. And then you have Bromden's mom again. Bromden's mom got bigger, he says, in confidence while his dad got smaller. And then you have Candy and the other woman who are two sex workers, and they're not portrayed negatively, but they're just there as like sex objects who do what the men say. Oh, and then you also have Harding's wife, who is also more domineering, and it's like insinuated that she sleeps around and stuff too. And I read a blog post that I will link to on my blog, so at Why the Book Wins, I link to it. And they talk about the sexism within this book. And I just wanted to share a few passages that they wrote. Some of it is just reiterating what I just said, but I thought they worded it very well. So I'm just going to quote them a bit. Kesey used the novel to give his negative response to newly changing gender roles. In his 1962 novel, he promoted sexism and misogyny through various tools like derogatory language towards women, the subjugation of powerful women, and continuous fight over masculinity versus femininity. Another female character, Candy, the main sex worker, seems to be described as the opposite of Nurse Ratched. The reader doesn't really get to know her because she's only mentioned in the story in regard to her physical appearances and doing whatever McMurphy tells her to. She's portrayed as someone who has a heart of gold due to her passivity and is only there to please men in her role as a sex worker. McMurphy attacks the nurse and starts choking her right after tearing up her uniform to expose her large breasts and reveal her femininity, the one thing that she tried to hide from the very beginning of the book. This appears to be a metaphorical rape, even though the book tries to justify it through Bromden's remarks that the act was a hard duty that finally just had to be done, like it or not. Although McMurphy's life is upside down at that point, he succeeds in his goal of giving the men their victory through breaking Nurse Ratched's defenses. After her refeminization by McMurphy, Chief remarks that her new uniform could no longer conceal the fact that she was a woman, and it is implied that because of this, she couldn't rule with her old power anymore. Throughout the novel, Kesey uses sexuality to condemn women in power as unnatural beings. He criticizes women who want to reform by describing the big nurse as a masculine machine, indicating that she has to adopt male characteristics in order to receive control of something bigger than just their homes. By giving the men their power back at the end, Ken Kesey ends the novel with as stubbornly sexist a tone as it started. He reassures men in his era that traditionally they are superior, and they can reassert the power if they believe to have lost it if they wished. So just very well put, and I agree with that blog post a lot. And moving on to another problematic aspect of this book is the racism, because again, there's no nuance to the black orderlies. And there's white orderlies as well, but the white orderlies are just briefly mentioned in passing, and the only orderlies that have like a feud and there's tension with McMurphy there and that like are mean and abusive to the mental patients are the black orderlies. And as said, McMurphy uses various racial slurs against them, and it just seems like such a weird choice that Kesey chose to have a bunch of white men against women and black men, right? Like that's literally what it is. The woman nurses, specifically Nurse Ratched, and the black orderlies are always against odds with these white men. And I just do not understand that choice. It's just like cringy at best and just offensive at worst. And so, yeah, it was just such a weird choice. Like he could have made some of the nurses men. He could have made the doctors be a more domineering force, but the doctor in the movie, he's like on Nurse Ratched's side. And so, but then in the book, the doctor is like the same level as the patients basically. And the nurse like emasculates the doctor as well. And then, yeah, so it's the nurse and these black orderlies against all the white men, whether they're the patients or the doctors. And yeah, I just do not understand that. Like why, unless Kesey was, clearly he was a sexist, right? He was also part of the hippie movement, right? Which is like the hippie movement kind of goes along with the feminist movement in a way. At least he had Bromden be a Native American who was very fleshed out and had a lot of depth. So at least there's that. But also Harding in the book, it talks about how he is gay and how society made him think that there was something wrong with him because of his sexuality, but there wasn't. Society just put that on him. And so at least, even though the book is sexist and racist, at least it's not homophobic, and at least we have a fleshed out Native American character. But yeah, anyway, I'm just very confused by Kesey's choice in some aspects of this book. But anyway, but getting back into the plot. So McMurphy. There's a scene in the book and movie where, you know, the nurse plays the same music over and over again in like the main rec room area. And there's a part where McMurphy's trying to play cards with some of the people and he's like, man, like it's so hard to hear over this music. And so he goes up to the nurse and he asks her if they could turn it off. And the nurse is like, I mean, clearly you're forgetting the men in here who are comatose and like this music is all they have. And McMurphy acknowledges like, okay, you're right. I hadn't thought of that. And then later he ends up meeting with a male doctor, Dr. Spivey, and he and the doctor right away hit it off. And he convinces the doctor to bring this up in the next group therapy meeting because in the book, the doctor is not in the movie, the doctor is not part of the group therapy meetings, but in the movie, the doctor is there for all of them. And so in the next group therapy meeting, the doctor brings it up saying that they should use the tub room as a card room for the men who want to play cards and not have the music playing. And he is able to get the nurse to agree to this. Whereas in the movie, they just suddenly are playing in the tub room and we don't see how that came about and the doctor had nothing to do with it in the movie. In the book and movie, we get the scene where McMurphy makes a bet that in the tub room, because it's where there's like literal tubs, because they used to do something. In the book, it explains it. There used to be something done in this tub room, but they don't do it anymore, so now it's just empty all the time. Anyway, there's this like big cement panel, marble panel with like these faucets and controls on it. And so McMurphy makes a bet that he can lift the panel. And they're like, are you insane? Like nobody could lift that. And McMurphy also kind of realizes he probably can't lift it, but he makes the bet anyway and he tries to lift it. And at first, like he's being kind of sarcastic or smart alecky or whatever, and other people are making remarks. But then he like really is trying and everybody becomes serious as they watch him like put all of his effort into trying to lift this panel. And ultimately he's unable to lift it. But then as he walks out of the room, he turns around and he's like, but I tried, didn't I? Like, by God, I tried. And that was a fantastic scene in the book. Like it just like gave you chills. And the movie showed it really well too. And it is such an important scene because the men are scared of trying anything. And so even though McMurphy failed, the fact that he sincerely tried inspires the men. And then another part is that Cheswick and McMurphy want to watch the World Series. And in the book, I'm pretty sure Cheswick is the one who brings it up, whereas in the movie, it's McMurphy. But anyway, him and Cheswick. But they bring it up in one of the meetings because they want to switch the TV time. They're like, usually we have TV time like in the evening, but we want to bump it up and have it like during the time we're supposed to clean, and then we'll clean in the evening instead. So like, it's not that big of a deal, right? And so the nurse is like, okay, well, we can put it to a vote. And Cheswick and McMurphy are the only two who vote in favor of it. And McMurphy is just disgusted at the cowardice of the other men who refuse to vote. And then the next day he brings it up again to vote, but this time the men in the meeting, you know, they have their courage and they all raise their hand and they all vote in favor to switch the TV time, and McMurphy is ecstatic. But then the nurse is like, you're forgetting about all these comatose patients out here, like they count too, so unless you get one of them, it's still not a majority, which is clearly unfair. And so McMurphy, he goes out there and he's trying to talk to them, but all of these patients are just so out of it that they're not registering what he's saying. And so he's going from each one trying to get them to vote, and it's just not going well. And the nurse is like, voting is over, the meeting is over, whatever. But then he goes to Bromden, and Bromden ends up raising his hand. And so McMurphy again is like, we got it, it's a majority, Bromden voted, that means we get to watch the World Series. But the nurse is like, no, voting ended, so that doesn't count, and we keep TV time the same. And in the movie, he's sitting in front of the TV being like, we won the vote, like I'm just waiting for the TV to turn on. But of course she never turns the TV on. But McMurphy in the movie, he starts cheering and yelling as if he is watching a baseball game. And so all of the other patients come over and they're all just like cheering and acting like they're watching a baseball game. Meanwhile, the nurse Ratched is just behind her glass, like furious at this. And that was a fantastic scene in the movie. I absolutely loved it. It plays out the same in the book, except the World Series goes on for a few days. And so every day for a while, they all just sat in front of the TV when they should have been watching the World Series. It doesn't talk about them cheering or anything, but basically they just sit in front of the blank TV for like 2 hours for every day for a little while, which was also great. But in the movie, I just love that scene where they're all cheering, acting like they're watching a game. It was great. And then in the book, shortly after this, they're at the pool and Cheswick purposefully gets his hand stuck in the grate at the bottom of the pool and he ends up drowning. So that did not happen in the movie. Cheswick lives throughout, but yeah, definitely a sad part in the book. And then onto the fishing trip. So in the book, once a patient has been there for a month, they can request a day leave where they go out and do something. And so McMurphy McMurphy requests to go on a fishing trip with his 2 aunts, but the boat they are renting requires him to have 10 men in total to help chip in. And Bromden ends up being like the final guy who agrees to go. And the 2 aunts that are taking them are actually 2 prostitutes that McMurphy knows. However, the day of the trip, only one of the women, Candy, shows up and she's like, sorry, the other one like ran off and got married. She's gone now. And so they don't have enough people because they can't all fit in Candy's car. However, McMurphy is able to convince the doctor to join them. So then the doctor is the second car and they drive out to the boat. And this is just the book, by the way. I'll be talking about the movie's version of this fishing trip after. So in the book, they stop at a gas station on their way to the boats. And the gas station attendants like can tell like they're mental patients, but the doctor is very ashamed that he's there with mental patients. And so he lies and he says something else about them, but he's embarrassed and ashamed. And that just makes the patients embarrassed and ashamed of themselves as well. And the attendants can sense this and they're just picking on them. But then McMurphy shows up and he just flaunts the fact that they're from the mental institution. And he even exaggerates how crazy they are. And seeing him, that he's like not hiding the fact and he's almost proud of it, it gives all the men so much confidence and they all just embrace it and they just have this new confidence. However, once they get to the boat place, McMurphy needs to speak privately with the guy in charge, so he's in the office with the guy. Meanwhile, some other like boat dock workers start picking on Candy and they're like harassing her. And the men, just a minute ago at the gas station, they had all this confidence, but now suddenly without McMurphy around, they are just like ashamed and insecure again. And so while these men are picking on Candy, she's looking to them being like, why aren't you saying anything? But they're not standing up for her. And she eventually kind of wanders off to get away from these men who are harassing her. But then McMurphy comes back out of the office and he sees Candy walking away and he's like, what are you doing? Come on, get over here. And they all go out on the boat and go fish. And while they're on the boat, McMurphy and Candy go in the cabin and the other men are out fishing and guiding the boat. But then like things get out of control and they need McMurphy's help. So while he's in the cabin, they're yelling at him to get his help. And so there's like a big fish coming in on one of the lines and Candy is actually the one that comes out and she helps them get the fish while McMurphy just stands laughing, just enjoying the moment. Whereas in the movie, the patients will get together on a bus and like have a trip out somewhere. Not McMurphy though, but at one point he jumps the fence and then he hijacks the bus and he drives them. He picks up Candy and then he drives them to a boat place and they rent a boat. And the same thing happens where he puts them in charge of the boat and the fishing and he and Candy go into the cabin. Same thing where they need his help and they call him. And in the movie, McMurphy helps them get the fish, not Candy. So that was a difference right there. And there's no scene in the movie of like Candy being picked on. And there's no gas station scene either. And then in the book, so after this fishing trip, the nurse says that like all the men who were on the fishing trip need to be like thoroughly cleaned. And so while they're in line to be cleaned, the 2 of the black orderlies, Warren and Washington, start picking on this one guy and bullying him. And so McMurphy steps in telling them to stop and he gets in a fight with the orderlies and then Bromden gets involved as well. And so because of this fight they get in, Bromden and McMurphy are sent to this like other ward where they are going to get electric shock. And when they get electric shock, it's a great sequence in the book because it's this like cool dreamlike flow of consciousness scene where Bromden is just like mentally not there due to the electric shock. And so it was very cool the way that scene was written. And McMurphy, like the shock would affect him, but then as soon as he got back to his normal self, they gave him more shocks. And so they're up there for like a week, I think. And meanwhile, in the main ward, there's like all these rumors being spread about McMurphy being like, oh, I heard the electric shock doesn't affect him at all. And like, oh, like he's raising all this hell up there in that ward and just believing in the idea of McMurphy and what he symbolizes and that he's beyond electric shock. And so like mythologizing him in a way. But eventually he does come back to the main ward. And in the book, he just comes back to the main ward and he seems fine. And in the movie, when he comes back to the main ward, he walks in kind of zombie-esque as if he's not there. And people are like, oh my gosh, what's wrong? But then he's just fooling them and he's like, haha, got you. So that was a good moment in the movie. And then in the book, so after that fishing trip, when they're on the way home, Candy and Billy are sitting side by side and Billy is into Candy. And so McMurphy arranges it to have Candy come to the ward at 2 a.m. 2 weeks from now and she and Billy can hook up. Whereas in the movie, one night he sneaks into the office when no one is in there and he calls up Candy and he tells her to show up. But in both, even though the reasons are different, in both Candy and a friend show up to the ward and they bring booze and they get the night orderly who's on guard. They get him to be down for it and they bring him alcohol. And in the movie, he is like concerned about losing his job. And this is the Scatman Crothers guy. But then he like kind of passes out and then it's, they're just doing whatever they want. They have this huge party on the ward and they're getting drunk. And in the book, because she showed up to be with Billy, she ends up sleeping with Billy early on. And while they're partying and everything, Harding is concerned about McMurphy because he's like, you need to escape sometime before the nurse shows up. And so he has this plan on how McMurphy can escape, but McMurphy just doesn't seem that concerned, and he's just kind of like, whatever. Then they're just partying, and then they end up just falling asleep, and they don't wake up until the nurse and orderlies show up the next day. Whereas in the movie, McMurphy called Candy and her friend to just show up, and so they're there partying, and he's planning on running away with Candy and this other woman before the night is through. However, when he's saying goodbye to everybody, he sees Billy kind of acting, shy, and he goes up to Billy, and he finds out that Billy is interested in Candy, and he's like, okay, you and Candy can go sleep together, and then when that's done, I'm leaving. And he's like, it won't last long, so we'll be leaving soon. However, they all end up falling asleep, and they don't wake up till the next morning. And the morning after this party is basically the same in book and movie. So Nurse Ratched shows up, and they find Billy alone with Candy in that room. And the nurse knows his mom, and his mom is very manipulative, like I talked about earlier. And so she sees Billy's with this woman, and she's like, you should be so ashamed of yourself. Like, what do you think this will do to your mother when she finds this out? And Billy is very distraught, and he doesn't want his mother to know this. And so he says that McMurphy forced him to do it, and it wasn't his fault. But she's like, well, we'll just have to see, and blah, blah, blah. And so then she sends him into the doctor's office. And shortly after that, there is a scream because a nurse finds Billy, and he has slit his throat with like a knife that was in the doctor's office. And the nurse acts as if it wasn't her fault that Billy had died. And McMurphy just can't take it anymore, and he runs over and he starts strangling the nurse. In the book, like I read earlier, he rips her uniform first, and he reveals her chest, and then he starts strangling her. In the movie, he just starts strangling her. But anyway, so he's on top of her strangling her, and then the orderlies get him off and they take him away. But yeah, in the book, it is just like his hero moment is this moment when he finally like attacks the nurse, which one, it's like violence against women is like his hero moment. And then also the fact that he reveals her breasts is just it's so violating and so sexist. And just, again, it's as if him revealing that she's a woman proves that, like, look at, she's a woman and that's her weakness, and like as if it's a bad thing that she's a woman and that she's in charge, right? Moving on to the ending. So in the book, McMurphy is taken away, and while he's gone, a lot of the other patients check out because a lot of them were in there voluntarily. And remember, Harding had said that they were all rabbits. And the night of the party, when Harding is explaining how McMurphy can escape, McMurphy is like, why don't you come with me? And Harding is like, no, like I want to check out the official way with my wife picking me up because I want her to know that I can do it. And he's like, it's okay for you to leave now because we're men now. We're not rabbits anymore. We're men. And so yeah, a number of them check out. And then after this, Bromden of course is still there because Bromden was not in there voluntarily. And so McMurphy is brought back one day, and he is just like a vegetable because he has had a lobotomy and he's very out of it. And Bromden and the other men who had known him see him come in, and they're like, what? Like, that's not McMurphy. Like, I can see they tried to make him look like McMurphy, but obviously that's not him. Like, it's a good replica, but that's not McMurphy. However, that night, Bromden ends up just suffocating McMurphy with a pillow, and after he's done, one of the other patients is like, did you do it? Is it finished? Meaning that they were acting like they thought it wasn't McMurphy, but they all knew it really was McMurphy, and that they agreed to have Bromden kill him because it was better for him to die than to continue living as a vegetable. And I loved that in the book they refused to admit that it was McMurphy they saw because, that's what the nurse wanted, to see them so distraught that their hero and this symbol of freedom and inspiration and hope, she wanted to see them acknowledge that their hero had fallen, right? And that he was no longer what he was. But because they didn't acknowledge it was McMurphy, she never got that payoff, But yeah, from there, Bromden then lifts up that panel that McMurphy tried to lift. He puts it through a window and he runs away and escapes, and that is the end of the book. In the movie, it's a little different because all of them are still there. It doesn't show any of them checking out. And McMurphy is brought in at night, which why would the nurse have him come back at night? In the book, she brought him back in the daytime because she wanted people to see what had become of him, right? Whereas in the book, they bring him in at night, and then they have him lie down in bed, and Bromden goes over and he's like, hey, I've been waiting for you to come back because we're going to run away together. I've been waiting. But then he sees McMurphy's head, and there's a scar showing that he has had a lobotomy. Which, by the way, lobotomies were done through the eye, so there would be no scar. I learned that when doing my Shutter Island book verse movie, where there was some lobotomy talk. So if you want to hear about that, you can check out my Shutter Island book versus movie. Anyway, so he sees that McMurphy is now just a shell of the man he once was, and so he suffocates him with a pillow. He gets the panel, breaks it through the window, and runs away. And while he is doing this, the Christopher Lloyd character cheers and is like, happy to see what Bromden is doing. And that last scene in the movie was incredible. The music that they had playing, and then the acting of Bromden, and then the Christopher Lloyd character, like, it was just a great scene and a great ending. But this has been a longer episode. But before I get to book versus movie, which maybe you already know, which I like better anyway, but I wanted to talk about the Christ symbolism because, like I said, I thought that was a very interesting aspect of this book. And so I will begin with Bromden because Christ healed the blind, the deaf, the dumb, like the lepers. He healed all these people, right? And Bromden had been, deaf and dumb, quote unquote. But then with McMurphy's presence, Bromden speaks and hears again. And so it's like he's giving that back to Bromden. And also Christ befriended prostitutes, and McMurphy, his two friends, are these two prostitutes. And there's that scene in the Bible where they want to stone the prostitute and Christ stops them and helps her. And that was similar to in the book when the fishermen are like bullying Candy, and all of the men are standing by letting it happen, and it's McMurphy who shows up and like rescues her from that situation. And then we also have the scene in the Bible where Christ and his disciples are on the boat and he's trying to sleep in the cabin, but then the storm is getting, a lot, and the disciples are scared, and so they wake him up from the cabin being like, we need your help. And this is obviously the same in the book as well, where he's sleeping in the cabin with Candy, and then they need his help and call him out from the cabin. And there's also a part in the book where it's after Harding's wife visits, and Harding asks McMurphy, like, so what do you think? And he's wanting McMurphy to be like, wow, yeah, you have it tough. Like, your wife sucks. But McMurphy instead is upset. And he's like, what do you want from me? Like, you people need to stop leeching off of me, stop using me and needing me. Like, it's just, I'm being drained by you because you need me so much to be this symbol of something and to validate your feelings or whatever. And there is a scene very similar to that in Cool Hand Luke, where Luke is just like, it's too much. These men that like need him to be something for them. And he gets to the point where he's like, back off, like, get away from me. And I don't know if there's a parallel to that in the Bible or not, maybe, but I thought that was an interesting similarity between Cool Hand Luke and Cuckoo's Nest though. But anyway, when McMurphy gets electroshock, there's a part where as they're getting him prepared for it in the book, he says like, am I going to get my crown of thorns too? Referencing that he is, a sacrifice and a martyr. And McMurphy, of course, sacrifices himself in the end, and his sacrifice gives the others the freedom and the hope and the inspiration that they need to free themselves from this situation and to get their confidence back. And the night of the party is very similar to the Last Supper in a way. And also when Harding is trying to plan the escape from McMurphy like doesn't seem that interested. And that's similar to when one of the disciples tells Christ that he doesn't have to go through with this and he doesn't have to die. But Christ is, no, I do have to do this. And then also Billy betrays McMurphy in a way when he says that McMurphy forced him to sleep with Candy. And then after that, Billy commits suicide. And Judas betrayed Christ. And then after that, Judas committed suicide. And there's also this part in the book, not in the movie, where the men start to question McMurphy and not trust him because the nurse is pointing out like, McMurphy is getting something out of this. You're acting like he's playing cards and doing this and doing that, and it's all for you, but he's getting something out of it. Like, he's just using you. And so they all start to be wary of him. And that could be similar too to the Bible, where the disciples at times denied Christ because the world and the people made them ashamed and made them question their connection with him. And so they were starting to doubt him as well, the same way they started to doubt McMurphy. And also in the book, there's a part where McMurphy breaks the glass to get the cigarettes that are behind the nurse station. He does that in the movie. He does it once and it's during a therapy meeting. In the book, he does it kind of out of the blue, and he does it 3 different times. So they keep putting new glass up and he just keeps breaking it, and he breaks it 3 times. The 3 times seems significant. I don't know if there's like a biblical parallel there, but it seems like maybe there is. And then, of course, Christ died for our sins, and you could say that McMurphy died to free the men from the sins the world put on them. They were in there voluntarily because the world made them feel like they were wrong and something was off with them. And so they chose to be in this situation. But then after McMurphy, they realized, they're freed from those judgments and those quote unquote sins the world has put on them, and they're able to release themselves from this mental institution and have the confidence they need to get back out into the world. And now onto book versus movie. So there's some aspects of this book, like I said, it is wonderfully written, and I do think the biblical parallels are fascinating and really well done. However, I will say the movie wins just because it's not offensive, and that really did. I would have, this book could have been 5 stars, right? Except the weird choices of making it white men against women and black men and acting like being a woman is a weakness. And so the sexism and racism of this book brought it down to like a 3-star read for me when it could have been 5 stars. Whereas the movie I gave 4 stars. I'm not like in love with it, but it was a very well done movie, great performances. I also do love the 70s style cinematography. I feel like, I mean, all directors are different, but I feel like different eras, you can kind of tell what decade it's from, not just from the quality, but just the directing style. And so I do like that. But yeah, I would say the movie wins over the book, and Kesey famously did not like this adaptation. The reason he didn't like it is because they left out the Combine aspect, because Bromden is often talking about like the world and the people in charge as the Combine, and how the Combine tries to belittle men and emasculate them and make them feel small. But then McMurphy comes along and he like defies the Combine and he defies Nurse Ratched and he gives the men their confidence back. But yeah, anyway, I preferred the movie personally, so let me know your thoughts down in the comments. So let me know what you think down in the comments about this book, about this movie, about Ken Kesey. Happy 2023, by the way. Here's to a new year full of book versus movie episodes. And thank you so much for supporting my channel and subscribing, liking this video. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to give it a rating and review. I would really, really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you again to everybody who makes requests. I really appreciate it. Thank you again to Shelby for requesting this one. And I will see you next time. Bye.